This is a production of Cornell University.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me. It feels funny to be here 2 weeks in a row, but I'm really honored to be asked to present. And I actually realized as I got my slides rather ready that I presented in SIPS, I think last September. So I have to make sure, I had to make sure I wasn't repeating myself with the slides that I put together today, because what I had in mind was kind of an overview of the work that I've been involved with for the last 20 plus years. So I've skipped the first 10 in this presentation so that you're not bored if you happen to have been here last year. What I am wanting to present on is, and Andy mentioned agroecological approaches. So some of you may not be familiar with this, even though there are people in SIPS who also use an agroecological approach in their research. It's both a science that grew out of ecology and agronomy, beginning really in the 1930s. And a set of practices, so everything from intercropping, the use of mulch, the use of cover crops, the use of compost, botanical pesticides, so sort of series of practices that really try to use ecological principles in agricultural production. And a social movement, because agroecology also tries to use a holistic approach to food systems that addresses the social, political, and economic and health dimensions of our food system, not just production. And in that sense, it's paid attention to the needs in particular of smallholders, farmers, and try to address issues around access to land, rights to seed, and questions around fairness and equity in the food system. And so I was involved in a UN report, writing a UN report with a team last year, looking at the potential for agroecological approaches to address food security and nutrition in particular. And this was commissioned by the Committee for World Food Security of the United Nations. And so in our assessment of agroecology, and this scale here was one developed by Steve Gleesman, who's one of the kind of early scientists writing about agroecological approaches. As sort of early transitions using an agroecological approach, you might be substituting synthetic fertilizer with organic fertilizer, for example. And then as you kind of transition into a more holistic agroecological system, you start to redesign at a farm level to make it sort of following these ecological principles. But then as you really try to transition the food system, you're addressing some of these political and social dimensions and economic dimensions of the food system. So we came up with these 13 principles that drew from the scientific literature on what agroecology is about, but also drew from the social movements who've been advocating for this approach to addressing our food system and to really transform our food system to make it more environmentally friendly and more socially equitable and economically viable for smallholder farmers. And at the center, you see this co-creation of knowledge as being a really important feature of agroecology that makes it change from really sort of field level changes to transitioning the food system more broadly. So on the bottom level, you see many of the things that may be very familiar in the crop and soil sciences. So things like synergies between plants and animals within your farming system, enhancing biodiversity, reducing reliance on external inputs, particularly those that are fossil fuel based, enhancing soil health, ensuring animal health. But then as you move into this higher level transition, because you're transitioning a broader system, you're paying attention to social values and paying attention to diets and health. you're ensuring economic diversification, you're trying to ensure that people have a say in the food system. So participation is sort of food democracy, if you will. And then who has rights and control over land and natural resources, water, seeds, land. Is there fairness and equity in the food system at multiple levels? And is there greater connectivity between producers and consumers? So reconnecting the producer-consumer links in the food system. So attention to local markets, for example, local and regional markets. So this is, I introduced this, and now I'm going to talk about the work that I've been involved with in Malawi and some of the different ways that we have tried to use this approach and some of the findings that we've had. Malawi, for those of you unfamiliar with it, is a country in Southern Africa. It's landlocked. It is a maize-dominated system with some tubers and legumes. And tobacco is the main cash crop for smallholder farmers, some large-scale estate production of tobacco, tea, and sugarcane. And about a quarter to a third of households have have animals, but it's a mixed system. And the soils are relatively low in soil fertility, with about 1,500 millimeters, and that would range across the country, but the areas where I've worked in, around 1,500 millimeters of rainfall a year, one rainy season. And over the last 20 years, a real push, but even before that, a real push for maize production, a real focus on calories and on maize production with the use of fertilizer, and in particular, a fertilizer subsidy program that provided the majority of farmers with a subsidy for reduced application of fertilizer and hybrid maize seed, and some promotion of compost, but a real focus on maize production. So the country has high rates of chronic food insecurity and has had consistently high rates of child malnutrition, hovering at around 40 to 50% of all children under 5 malnourished, undernourished for their age. And the average income is around 350 to 400 US dollars a year. So very high levels of poverty. And alongside these challenges, you have high levels of gender inequality and high rates of HIV/AIDS. So this is a place where the majority of people are smallholder farmers, and you have multiple intersecting challenges that make it difficult to address food security and nutrition. And it's a place where the dominant model has been intensification with synthetic inputs for the last over 20 years. And even before that, in previous, under previous regimes, governments. So I've been involved in a long-term partnership with a nonprofit organization that actually initially was a research project run out of a hospital. And it began with an initiative to try to address child stunting rates in collaboration with the hospital. And they now have their own farmer-led nonprofit organization. They have their own farmer research and training center. And we've been doing collaborative research together for the last 20 years. So if you were here last year, you would have seen some of the first 10 years of our work together. And we've done work on child feeding practices, on cultural ideas around child nutrition. We've done a real focus on legume intercrops for the first 10 years. And it's interdisciplinary, and we've had a lot of collaboration with other university scientists from other universities in Canada and Germany, Norway, and in Malawi as well. So while I'm presenting, there's a team behind me of people who are heavily involved in this research. And I'll highlight some graduate student work in particular later on. So in 2012, we were able prior to 2012 to demonstrate that an agroecological approach at a small scale could lead to improvements in child nutrition. And it was this work that led to this large scale effort in 2012, working with 6,000 farming households in northern and central Malawi, where they were provided with training of about 2 weeks on agroecological principles, enough seed for around a quarter of an acre, for them to test different agroecological strategies, and also sort of training on gender equity, climate change, and child nutrition. And we then invited them to do whatever experiments they were interested in trying based on what they'd learned. And we tracked change over time. And we tracked it through structured surveys, through agronomic data collection, and through in-depth interviews. And so this is called the Malawi Farmer to Farmer Agroecology Project, and it's been sort of real focus of my work for the last, it finished after 5 years, but we're still analyzing some of the data. So farmers did a range of experiments, including agroforestry, intercropping of legumes, the use of compost, crop diversification, including incorporation of indigenous crops that had largely disappeared from the landscape, the use of sort of natural pesticides made out of plants that farmers could produce at home, livelihood diversification, the use of increased integration of animals into farming systems, and then this overall focus on gender equity and child nutrition. And for that, we had a number of different educational strategies that we used. I'm just wondering, is the screen that you're seeing my presenter view, or is it the big screen?
It's just the presenter view, Rachel. It's good.
Oh, marvelous. I don't know how to change that now. So I'm looking on my big screen at the non-presenter view. You can see all my notes. That's great.
No, we can't see your notes. It's normal.
Oh, it's normal. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's what I meant, Rachel. Yeah, it's as it should be.
Thank you. Okay. So the we tried a number of different things, and the ideas that we came up with came from different farmers. So for example, we had recipe days where people brought together food and prepared meals, but really encouraging men to prepare those meals as a way to encourage men to take more of a role in childcare and cooking. We did theater, and I'm saying we, but it was really Malawian led, and I was involved in helping with the research component, although you can actually see me in this photograph because I was able to participate in a day where there was singing and theater around gender issues, and then field days and a number of other activities, small group discussions to really focus on culturally appropriate ways to change gender dynamics. And this is a big emphasis of the project. So we have been able to show significant improvements in food security and income for households who are using these agroecological practices, with crop diversity in particular being significantly associated with improvements in food security after controlling for other factors that would lead to improvements in food security. And we've dug into that in more depth. And this is a paper that just came out last month in Social Science and Medicine, where we tried to examine the relationship between farm diversity, so animals and crops, and dietary diversity. And we found that an increase in both of those things with the intervention, and farm diversity had a positive effect on dietary diversity. And dietary diversity is a good measure of diet quality and is associated with improvements in nutrition outcomes. So nutritionists care a lot about dietary diversity. Dietary diversity is a measure of, in the last 24 hours or in the last week, out of these categories of food, how many did you eat? And it's a standardized measure that we used. So we found a direct relationship between an increasing production diversity and an increase in dietary diversity. And we used mediation analysis. And this work was done by a PhD student in Canada, Moses Kansanga, who's now just started a tenure track job this year. Where we found this direct relationship and mediated by other variables such as education, farm size, and wealth. Crop diversity is in a sense a really simple agroecological practice, but maybe perhaps complex because it's affected by so many other factors, but very powerful as something to improve dietary diversity. We also looked at, what's the likelihood of someone transitioning from being in food insecure condition. And for food insecurity, we measured that with a series of questions that's been validated, actually developed by folks here at Cornell in the nutrition division. So there's 9 different questions asking about people's state of food security. And so even though it's not a direct measure, it's considered a valid measure, and it's closely associated with nutritional direct biological measures. So it's called the Household Food Insecurity Access Scale, and we found that there was this relationship between the number of agroecological practices that people were taking on and the likelihood that they would transition to food security. And so the kinds of practices that seemed to matter were, again, crop diversity, incorporating residue, legume residue back into the soil, so building soil health, compost, again, building soil health, and legume intercrops. Now, I would expect that these particular practices would vary a lot by place. In Malawi, where soil fertility is a real constraint and where dietary diversity is low, I think that's why you see these really powerful impacts from these practices of building soil health and increasing farm diversity. We've really honed in on what are the implications for labor and what are the implications for gender. And I think we have what I would call a mixture of results. So this is from a paper that we published last year. While farmers really felt that the labor impacts were not high because they were largely reallocating their labor from working on other people's farms when they ran out of their own food stocks to investing more in their own farms and no longer having to work on other people's farms during the hungry season. So they didn't see it as additional labor. Nonetheless, the division of labor, it could be uneven in households. So this quote is from a farmer who described, with great enthusiasm, the compost that was made, and making compost for rain-fed fields took months of preparation during the dry season so that you would have enough compost for your field. And he noted that my wife was pregnant, but carrying the compost wasn't tiresome because they're making the compost at home and then they're carrying it on their heads to the field, and that was some distance. And it took 2 trips, 4 bags, but I highlighted that because there's an assumption there that the wife didn't find it tiresome, but he's speaking on her behalf. He didn't see it as a burden because he was very keen to see if this had some effect, and it did have some effect. But nonetheless, in some cases, we found that women were having to make trade-offs between looking after young children or breastfeeding and doing extra weeding or extra planting that was required because agroecology is more labor intensive. And in some cases, people talked about a trade-off where they had a young infant, and because of the workload of wanting to do exclusive breastfeeding, choosing to not do some of the practices because they had limited labor. So definitely trade-offs involved in gender and involved in childcare and sometimes leisure as well, having less leisure available. We also were able to show, however, significant changes in gender relations from this combination of emphasis on agroecology, but also emphasis on changes in gender equity. And some of the changes that we saw, and here we use this women's empowerment in agriculture measure, some of the changes we saw were women having more of a say over what to grow and what to do with the harvest, and being more actively involved in speaking in public and sort of leadership roles, and reporting men getting more involved in household work. We're still working through that data set, but that we found encouraging. We went back last year to see, are people still using these practices, and did they share these seeds and practices with other people? And we found that out of a sample of 600 households, 90% were still applying compost, 80% were intercropping. So, the majority of them were still doing some practices, but only 37% were doing agroforestry. So some more likely to continue some practices than others. And compost making in particular, they reported as being quite labor intensive. Um, uh, about 45% were sharing seeds, far fewer sharing information. So we were finding that this kind of larger scale effort was less effective at sharing information around gender or child nutrition, for example. We did a follow-up with 33 farmers who had received seeds and information, and all of them reported using that information and seeds that they had received. So we weren't able to do a larger scale study. This was a small pilot project to test the, to look at what was happening post intervention, but we do find some evidence of it spreading beyond the participants in the intervention. This is just a map of the kind of movements of seeds and where they were going. So that's kind of one of the big initiatives I've been involved in. Now, this is a research project that was a 4-year research project, and one of my PhD students in development sociology, Sydney Madsen, has been very actively involved in this research project, where we are working with 500 households with a pre, post, and control intervention design, trying to understand in more detail some of the social and economic factors that were affecting people using these methods and some of the implications of increased agrobiodiversity in rural households. So a combination of quantitative and qualitative methods. And this research project was really done with active farmer researchers as part of the team of doing the interviews and doing the analysis. So really using a participatory research with the qualitative methods. And we saw in the course of just 3 years a significant change in crop diversity after one small seed distribution at the start of the project. Farmers maintained that and increased that crop diversification. And again, this crop diversity had significant impacts on food security, but we also found this connection with social support. So there was a relationship between sharing the seed and developing social support and reducing food insecurity. So it wasn't just a matter of people working on their own farms, but having a kind of network of a social network. And we explored that relationship more with our qualitative interviews. So farmers were saying that they had reduced labor actually from increased crop diversity because they had less weeding if they had more crops on one field. And they were consuming the foods that they ate. That wasn't a surprise. But then they were saving money on food that they would previously have purchased, and they were reinvesting and money that they would have used for fertilizer because they were adding compost and they were intercropping legumes. And they were using that savings and investing it in animals and investing it in dry season vegetable gardens. And this would allow them to no longer have to work on other people's farms. So they would able to get, there was a positive cycle where they, over each growing season, they were increasingly getting improved yields with improved soils and not delayed planting because they weren't having to go and work on other people's farms. And so that over time, they're really seeing improvements. In the central region where this project took place, because it was in the north and the central region, there was a drought, a severe drought, and the farmers in that year reported their fields where they had been investing this compost and residue incorporation performed much better than their neighbors who weren't using those practices. So they were seeing this in terms of climate change resilience as well. But in addition, they reported that in the past, they would have had to receive seed and food from their neighbors and kin, which is part of kind of social reciprocity in that context, in that cultural context. And now they were able to share. So as they increased their food security, they were also sharing more seed and more food. And so it was having this sort of widespread impact in the communities where this was happening. So now we're going to switch gears to Tanzania, just briefly, a 4-year project that was done with actually a nutrition PhD student here at Cornell, Vicky Santoso, as well as nutritionist Sarah Young, who was here and is now at Northwestern, and ActionAid Tanzania and university collaborators at NMAIST in Tanzania. A similar context of high soil infertility, drier region where we were doing our project, high levels of gender inequality, high levels of food insecurity, more livestock than in Malawi. And we used a similar methodology of some initial training, farmer-to-farmer training. Actually, these farmers traveled to Malawi and did a 2-week intensive course with colleagues in Malawi. And then peer-to-peer training on child nutrition, agroecology, and gender, and with 588 households. Again, this control intervention pre-post design. And the agroecological practices that they experimented with were crop diversification, legume intercrop, use of compost and manure, and farmer-to-farmer exchanges. And over this 4-year period, we saw a significant increase in crop diversity and intercropping. And we saw a significant decline in food insecurity, or improvement in food security. And we also measured child and women's dietary diversity, and we saw a significant improvement in both of those. So an improved quality of diet for children and for women. And I'm not showing the data here, but we also measured women's likelihood of depression using a standardized measure of depression, and saw a decrease in depression. And we did, again, mediation analysis and found that it was partly due to improved food security. That explained about a quarter of the analysis, but it also had to do with perceived improvement in gender relations, particularly around men helping more with household tasks. We measured a reported 30-minute increase in men helping with household tasks. So this, and a very small change in women having a little bit more say in how income was spent. And we had a lot of preliminary work in this project on gender dynamics in the household. So this sort of demonstrates the implications for mental well-being, which in a sense is not surprising, that if your food security is improved and you have more equitable workload, that can make you less likely to be depressed, but it's not something that's often studied. At least not in Southern African rural households, as far as I'm aware. So one of the current projects that I am leading is funded by the NSF and Belmont Forum, and it's in collaboration with folks in Germany, at the University of Würzburg, Norway, Canada, University of Western Ontario, and Malawi, Luanar, as well as SFHC. And in this project, we're really trying to understand, we're working with households that we began working with MAFA, and we're trying to see if there's any impact on wild biodiversity, birds, insects, bats, from the use of these agroecological practices. And we're doing it in collaboration with farmers who are learning of how to measure these kinds of biodiversity measures. And we're also doing research on their understanding of wild biodiversity. So we're sort of halfway through or partway through this research project. And this is preliminary findings where we found evidence that we've had a reduction in pest maize decline as there's been an increase in agroecological practice adoption at a village level, which we think is exciting. This analysis is led by Aaron Iverson, who actually was here on a postdoc for a number of years, and is now at, he's in Northern New York, I think St. Lawrence University. We also have looked at the implications of agroecological practices in terms of forest restoration. And this work is led by a PhD student at the University of Western Ontario, Daniel Piambara. And he has done this really interesting research where he's interviewed farmers about their perceptions of what's driving local deforestation. Deforestation rates are very high in Malawi, and done participatory GIS mapping of fallow areas and then non-fallow cropped areas, and then sort of also oral histories of how those lands have been managed over several years. And so he's found that, not surprisingly, agriculture is a driver of deforestation, but so is tobacco cultivation in particular, because of the need for cutting wood for flue-cured tobacco, and burning wood for construction. Those are some of the drivers, as well as charcoal production. But he's found, this is with a small sample of 24 farms, but he's found a significant relationship between agroecological practicing farms and an increase in land set aside for fallow. And this is using GIS mapping to look at the difference in area. So this is 24 farms over 5 years, whether they were in fallow, the green, or cultivated yellow, and found a significant difference between agroecology practicing farmers having more land put into fallow and less land cultivated over a 5-year period. And some of the structural factors that have fostered deforestation are local and national politics around bylaws and forest management, but also rising poverty and unemployment that lead to sort of high demand for charcoal in urban areas and a market opportunity. So agroecology is only part of the solution, I think, is part of what we're trying to say in this paper. You know, it's not changing land practices at a farm level is not going to reduce that entirely, but some really interesting findings nonetheless. And then he's also led this study looking at the evidence that agroecological methods improve crop health and yields. This is a paper under review where he used this leaf area index as a way to look at whether you had improved crop health from farms using agroecological practices. And he looked at, this is leaf area index and days after planting, and found a significant difference between agroecological farmers' leaf area index versus non-agroecological farmers. And these are some of the practices that they used. So using plant extracts instead of pesticides, and using the newer application. This is just, that's the fancy planet scope data. Don't ask me more about it because I can't tell you. This is, again, Daniel Piepambara's paper. So just, and I think I will have time for questions. Yes. So just to conclude, our work over the last 20 years has really shown that agroecological approaches can lead to significant improvements in food security, household well-being, nutrition, and increase in sustainable land management methods in Malawi and Tanzania. And this combination of participatory farmer-to-farmer methods where farmers aren't given sort of one input, but they're given a range of options and training on principles, and then they choose what they want to test. And then combining it with attention to social equity, particularly if you're interested in nutritional outcomes, which has been a big emphasis in our work. So really attention to social equity within households, but also between scientists and farmers, you know, ensuring that farmers have, you know, the full picture of what we're doing and are actively engaged in the research has been a big emphasis in our work. And there's a lot more research that can be done trying to understand some of these dynamics and trying to understand some of the impacts. So looking at wild biodiversity, that question is still unanswered, really. It's underway, trying to understand more about labor impacts. But to ensure long-term resilience for smallholder households in Malawi and Tanzania, and more broadly, there's a need to address broader social inequalities. So questions of land access, access to seeds, climate change impacts, and building local economies. I haven't presented on any of those today. I could give a different lecture another day, but since this is a soil and crops seminar, I focused on soils and crops more, but these factors are very real barriers and constraints to kind of scaling out agroecological approaches more broadly. And just to acknowledge the many collaborators that I've worked with over the years and that have funded this research. So I look forward to some questions.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was great. So we have a big crew today. So without further ado, why don't we get to it? The floor is open. So anyone who would like to ask a question, either raise your hand, or if nobody's talking, just chime in.
Rachel, thinking about that work that you did in Malawi, where you described diversification of the types of crops, could you give a few examples, maybe the top 5 crops other than maize that diversification involved?
Sure. So initially legumes, so groundnuts, pigeon pea, common beans, and then indigenous grains, finger millet, sorghum, and also tubers. Sweet potato, which you can eat the leaves and the root, for example. So those are some of the top hits.
Good, thank you. That's helpful.
You talked about the sort of soil fertility being a pretty limiting factor, and the LA numbers that you showed at the end, even with the agroecological practices, they're still only hitting about 1/3 of what we probably want to see. So that suggests that you're still very low in fertility. Do you see that going further with more of these practices?
Yeah, I think you would need more support to really hone in on improving soil fertility. You know, we're working with local resources that are available to farmers, so those vary, of course. And so I think agroforestry, there's been quite a lot of research in Malawi that has shown it to be quite effective at improving soil fertility, but that requires more financial resources that we had available, for example, to distribute. That's not something that farmers can do easily on their own. They need more support. So yeah, I think
legumes seem to be more like the 5-year term tool for that in many systems. So I don't know whether that applies to this one also. That you said they were burying legumes, which seems like a very helpful practice.
Yeah, so I think legumes are so critical, and that's really where we started. And pigeon pea is a great sort of in-between crop because it's semi-perennial. You can grow it for 5 years. It's got deeper roots. It's pulling nutrients from deeper in the system. There's some research done by SIGSNAP and others that show there's some chemical interaction that make more phosphorus available for other crops when pigeon pea is grown.
Yeah.
So big fan of pigeon pea. There needs to be more work on varietal varieties of pigeon pea, because some pigeon peas are shorter term and more prone to pest damage. And that's actually where our Farms for Biodiversity project arose, because of the high numbers of pests. So we're looking for different strategies for farmers to use for managing pests to really kind of foster and enhance pigeon pea production is one of our areas of interest. So yes, I think, and legumes of course vary in what they contribute for in terms of biomass.
Right.
And
Right.
you know, something like common bean isn't producing much in the way of biomass, but something like pigeon pea can produce quite a lot of biomass. There's other legumes like Tephrosia that is not an edible legume, so it requires farmers to set aside some land for soil fertility improvements. So some farms with more land available, that's an option for them. But for land strapped farmers, the edible legumes, I think, have a lot of potential. And a soil scientist would be able to give you better numbers than I can. But I know that SIGSNAP, I think, no, I won't be able to pull the number out of my head, but pigeon pea intercropped can give a very significant contribution for improving soil fertility.
Great.
DG Rossiter?
Oh, sorry, I've got to unmute. Thanks. I'm confused always when I hear about this agroecology with the integration between what I call the agronomy, which is most of what you've been talking about, which is very good, and then the social aims, the gender equity and all that, which is fine, also nothing wrong with that. But do they really have to be so tightly integrated? What I mean by that is I could think of having a larger scale or even a big commercial farm that used all these principles you're talking about. And on the other side, I could think of farm that wasn't using it, but was also going for these other principles. So when did this integration, why this very tight integration between the two concepts of the agronomy and these particular social benefits? How did that happen?
I didn't plant him, I swear. What a great question. When did it happen? I think in part it happened with social movements. It was from the start because they were looking for social benefits from agricultural production, not just increased production or more diversified production, or not just environmental benefits. So in Latin America, for example, in Brazil and in Mexico and other countries where there was smallholder organizing around trying to ensure environmental and social benefits from agriculture, there was from the start this linking between ecological production and making sure that this benefited more than just a few. Certainly, the scientific development of agroecology back in the 30s was largely focused on just the marrying of agronomy and ecology and not paying attention to this social dimension. But starting, I would say, around the 70s, this connection between the kind of social side and the political side and the agronomic and ecological side became more tightly aligned. And there's been a lot of scholarship and a lot of advocacy that these two are connected. If you only have the agronomic and ecological side, then you might have environmental benefits to agricultural production, but you may not see any impact in terms of food security or health benefits or livelihoods for small scale producers. So it's crucial that those two get connected if you want to have a sort of multi-faceted food system that has benefits in all of those dimensions.
Okay, thanks. That's clear. I just think then the title is a bit misleading. It seems like there should be maybe 2 words or something, because as you say, the idea of using ecological principles within agriculture is fine, and that is earlier. But that's very clear. Thanks a lot.
Great. Any other questions?
Yes, ma'am. I have a question. Just expanding on gender equity, I was hoping maybe the classes that the males, is it just the males attend, or do you also have females that attend it? And what goes on in those courses? Maybe some examples?
Thanks,
I would appreciate
Jeremiah.
it. And,
yeah, that's a great question.
Thank you for the presentation, ma'am. Appreciate it. It was really, really.
Thanks, Jeremiah. So the classes, there's a range of different strategies. So we've been trying a number. It is not easy to address gender inequity in the United States, let alone in other countries, right? So this isn't something that's solved overnight. And we have tried over the last 20 years a number of different things. We've tried small group discussions where we've had all men, all women, and actually divided by age. And in small group discussions facilitated by community members, and then coming together in a large group and talking about those small group discussions. We found that to have some impact. We've tried these community events where it's both men and women, and almost in a kind of celebratory, almost a performance demonstrating, different ways of being together. But with these recipe days, we've used theater where we've had different plays which local people perform and then discuss, different issues that come up, whether it's alcoholism or domestic violence or, unequal division of labor. So that's also been quite effective. And then even peer-to-peer visiting and discussion has been a feature. So a range of different things, some which are sex segregated and some which are integrated. It's, you know, sort of dialogue based as one of the real emphasis areas.
That was beautiful. Thank you, ma'am.
Are there more questions for Rachel? If not, Rachel, maybe I can ask you one.
Yeah, Andy, I've got a question. If
Sorry, go ahead, Phil.
Okay, thanks. Rachel, that was a wonderful presentation, and I was particularly taken with your multiple pathways to food security. I thought that was a terrific slide. And when you were talking about that, you talked about how there was a change over that time between members of families working off their own farm, working for other farmers, and then as conditions improved on the individual farms, ecologically and nutritionally, there was less need for folks to go off their own farm, and more need, of course, staying on the farm. How did the social networks change across that period? I mean, I assume what you were getting at is that with the rising agroecological methods, there was more seed and information sharing. Was that mediated by your project, or did that sort of spring up, you know, simultaneously or automatically? And
yeah,
what kind of social relations were there among farmers where folks were working, you know, across different farms previously?
Right. I mean, so previously, the more food insecure households, when they ran out of their own food stocks, would go and work on other people's farms, sometimes for pay and sometimes just for food. That's been a long-standing practice. There's a special name for that called ganyu, and it's considered a social obligation to hire someone if they are short of their own food. But it also is exploitative. Previously, I've done research on that dynamic, and it can be, you can imagine you have no food in your home, you're going to a neighbor who's better off and asking, can I work for you for food? It can be quite humiliating. There is a lot of seed sharing collectively, informally, and reciprocity is a very important social norm in Malawi. But not so much information sharing. So I would say certainly our intervention fostered more information sharing between farmers. We have found previously that there's very little information sharing about farming. And in fact, one study we did found only 10% of households talked about farming, even between husbands and wives. So there isn't a tradition of a lot of information sharing. Seed sharing, yes. And so I think that there was a lot of emphasis in the intervention around farmers talking to other farmers and sharing information. But then what they also talked about in those interviews is how they went from being kind of a beggar essentially to being someone who could be very generous, and that this, you know, facilitated more social networks for them. So that was something that that was something very important to them that they strongly appreciated. And it increased their social networks.
Thanks.
And I think also just on that point, there's a big emphasis in our work on experimentation, that farmers do their own experiments. And I think that was very empowering for farmers to think about them doing their own experiments. They try out their own thing. And they talked about how they were encouraged by the fact that it was a fellow poor farmers who were also using these methods, and that it wasn't just the well-off farmer who was using these methods. So that was important too.
Good.
I have a question. Sorry, I can't turn my camera on. I'm having some broadband issues, but a little bit of a departure from Mr. McMichael's question, but kind of building off Jeremiah's. I was wondering if you could explain a little bit more what the child nutrition education looked like, and then also what some of your measurements were for increased nutrition. And because I just have so many questions about the nutrition related aspect of things, I was wondering if given the initial lack of diversity in diet that you were talking about, if there are any widespread nutrient deficiencies that are present in the area that were worked on specifically in combating.
So I'll start with that one first. There are micronutrient deficiencies. Iron is a big one. Vitamin A. We have not measured either of those things. We previously did measure child growth, but that's quite, and in Tanzania, in the Tanzania project, we also measured child growth, so height and weight and arm circumference, but we haven't done that in Malawi for over a decade because it's quite intensive, and so my Malawian colleagues were not keen to include that as a measure if we didn't have to. So our main measure of child nutrition in Malawi has been dietary diversity as well as different child feeding practices. And for the MAFA project, we only measured child dietary diversity. We didn't go into more depth than that. In Tanzania, we have measured it's an index of child feeding practices for young children under the age of 2 that we use, and I don't think we've found a significant difference in those practices except for dietary diversity. Our nutrition education, we actually developed a curriculum that integrates nutrition with agroecology and climate change and gender, and the nutrition component is largely focused on increasing dietary diversity and exclusive breastfeeding and water and sanitation practices for young children, as well as responsive feeding. But a lot of the focus for us has been on exclusive breastfeeding and dietary diversity. I would say those would be the big areas of emphasis. In terms of what it's looked like, it's also varied a lot over time. We have gone from doing house-to-house visits to community events and theater. Similarly with gender, we've used theater for nutrition education. We have a 2-week training course that incorporates all of those things, and we have combination of like hands-on activities and theater and small group discussions and things like that. So it's kind of a mixture of all those things.
Thank you so much.
Are there more questions for Rachel? We're a little bit over time, Rachel. Apologies. Let me ask you just one quick question for future discussion, probably. But the approach that you've used has been multifaceted in terms of agronomic interventions and including things in crop genetics, and also very training heavy in the sense of deep engagement with a few number of farmers. And I'm curious if you could comment on some of your ideas around scaling, both in maybe a triage-based approach. We all know that sort of packages of practices are difficult to extend in the near term, and that the extension staff in East and Southern Africa usually is quite limited. So I'm curious, based on what you've learned from this deep engagement with these farmer groups, if you have some key insights on how to accelerate some transformations beyond the direct areas where you've worked.
Yeah, it's a big question. I think it has to involve farmer to farmer teaching and experimentation, because it has to be so agroecosystem appropriate. So I feel like there always has to be some component of farmers and the social piece. So farmers finding the right combination for their context. But I think, you know, the kind of agroecology schools there have been a number of them established in Latin America, which are led by farmer organizations or social movement organizations, might be a strategy for scaling out this approach, but with technical backstopping from scientists working alongside those organizations. I don't have a lot of confidence in the extension system working with this model, because the extension system, as far as I have seen it operate, largely uses this kind of tech transfer really, expert-driven model and sort of input-driven model. If it were possible to, revert, really overhaul the extension system to take that approach, I think that would be exciting. I'm not sure that really would be possible in the way that it's operated to date. So I think I would think about these kind of schools and then support for farmer-led initiatives in different places. I don't know if that fits the bill or not. That's kind of what I have in mind.
One of the grand challenges before us. Thanks a lot, Rachel. That was fantastic. You had a lot to the seminar series this semester, and we thank you for your presentation and your participation in the panel. They're both great. Thanks so much, and thanks a lot for everyone attending today and throughout the semester. Hope everyone has a decent next couple weeks as we finish things up. Be well. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.